A black man, just back from a long deployment, was excited to finally reunite with his family and head home. But when he stepped into the airport, everything changed. The moment he walked through the terminal, a racist officer approached him without any reason and immediately started harassing him. He was humiliated in front of everyone. His dignity stripped away with every word. Just 7 minutes later, something incredible happened. The officer who had targeted him was fired on the spot, leaving everyone in shock. What happened next no one could have predicted. And it set off a chain of events that turned the entire airport upside down. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive into it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. What started as an ordinary day turned into a defining moment that changed everything. The trouble with the world, Henry Latham often thought, was how quietly it turned its back. At 71, Henry had come to know this gesture well. The slight tightening of the mouth. The soft, dismissive nod. It was the same whether you stood in the street or sat in the corner of a cafe. But airports, he found, wore this indifference most plainly. It was late afternoon at Logan International, and the crowd hummed with the strange tension that only existed in the space between departure gates. Henry, standing just inside the terminal, tugged at the edges of his navy blazer. The uniform he wore did not shout for attention. No gold braids. No polished cap. Just a modest emblem stitched near the breast pocket. Pilot. Is this the line for pre-boarding? A woman asked, glancing briefly at him before continuing her search down the corridor. Henry nodded, but she was already gone. He had grown used to the second glances. The narrowing eyes that flickered with disbelief. As if the sight of a black man in a pilot's uniform demanded further scrutiny. They never asked outright. Not the way they once did, when he was a younger man just learning to fly. But their silence carried the same weight. Still, Henry walked on. It wasn't until he reached gate 14 that the day's first crack appeared. Sir? Excuse me, passengers are lining up over here for first class. The young agent behind the counter said, barely glancing up from her screen. Henry stopped. He had not stepped in line, nor made any motion toward it. He had only been standing by the window, watching the sun drift lazily across the runway. I'm not boarding yet, he replied gently. The agent's eyes flicked to his badge and then away again. Oh, right, of course. I just wanted to clarify. Clarify. Henry smiled faintly. I appreciate it, he said, though he wasn't certain what exactly she was clarifying. There was something peculiar about these moments. How they seemed to tumble quietly into his path. Unexpected but familiar, like stones left deliberately in the road. They rarely spoke in harsh tones. They whispered instead, as if hoping he wouldn't notice the weight pressed into his hand. Henry walked away without further word, but he felt the echo of the exchange long after the agent had returned to her screen. By the time boarding was announced, the evening sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Henry found his place in line behind a family of 4, the 2 children giggling and tugging at their father's sleeves. Big plane, one of them whispered, peeking toward the window. You're right about that, Henry replied, offering the boy a small smile. The father nodded politely, but his gaze lingered on Henry's uniform a beat too long. I didn't know they let pilots board this way, the man said, his tone light but curious. They usually don't. Henry might have left it there, but the boy's wide-eyed wonder softened him. I'm not flying tonight, just heading home after my shift. It was the truth, though Henry had long learned that truth did little to smooth the creases in strangers' faces. Ah, the father nodded. Long day, I bet. Henry smiled again. Long enough. Inside the cabin, Henry settled into his seat near the front. The hush of first class was distinct from the restless murmur of the coach. But here too, the atmosphere shifted as passengers filtered in. Somewhere near row 2, a woman paused abruptly, her hand gripping the edge of the seat. She had been placing her bag overhead when she caught sight of Henry. Her eyes flicked to the small plaque above his headrest, reserved, then back to him. You're in the wrong seat, she said. Her voice was not unkind, but firm. as though correcting a child who had wandered too far from his mother's side. Henry met her gaze steadily. No, ma'am, I'm right where I should be. The woman hesitated, her lips pressed together in that familiar way, tight, polite, but unyielding. Before she could respond, the flight attendant stepped in. Is everything all right here? The woman's eyes darted toward Henry once more. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. No problem, she said quietly, slipping into her seat. But Henry felt the weight of her glance for the remainder of the flight. Even as the engines roared to life and the world outside grew small beneath the clouds. It was not confrontation that wore a man down. Henry often thought that it was the absence of it. The quiet way the world built walls without mortar. How it taught you to navigate around doors that were never locked but never fully open. Tonight, as the plane drifted over the horizon, Henry gazed out over the curve of the earth and wondered if the world below had grown any softer. Any more willing to believe that a man like him belonged in the sky. The flight had been smooth, but Henry knew better than to mistake still air for peace. He could feel it, even now, unspoken, yet present. It lingered between the soft clicks of seatbelts and the quiet rustle of newspapers. Like static just beneath the skin. Somewhere behind him, the woman from earlier leaned toward her husband. Henry couldn't make out the words, but he heard the way her voice dipped low, folding around the shape of a question she would never ask aloud. Henry kept his eyes on the clouds outside the window. For the better part of his life, he had been told that he imagined these things. People said it with soft, dismissive smiles. You're reading into it too much, Henry. You can't walk through life expecting trouble. But Henry knew what it meant when people glanced his way and looked quickly down. How the space around him shifted just slightly, as if the air itself drew back. And yet, it was not their eyes that troubled him most. It was the silence that followed. The absence of acknowledgement. The way people seemed to quietly agree to let certain things pass without interruption. It was not cruelty that built these walls. It was comfort. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin had settled into the quiet hum of mid-flight routines. The lights overhead dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, distributing drinks and small packets of almonds as if by muscle memory. Henry accepted his glass of water with a polite nod, careful not to notice how the flight attendant's hand lingered an extra beat on the tray near his seat. He drank slowly, letting the ice melt between sips. Across the aisle, the woman in seat 2A shifted in her chair, casting a glance toward Henry that she did not bother to disguise. Her eyes did not hold anger. Curiosity, perhaps, suspicion, the kind that asked, "What are you doing here?" Henry had seen it before. A man in a pilot's uniform was meant to be a symbol of authority, reassurance at 30,000 feet. But there were those who felt reassured by the sight of a uniform only when worn by the right kind of man. Henry knew he was not the kind they had in mind. "You were a pilot, then?" The voice caught him by surprise. It belonged to the man seated one row behind a heavy-set businessman whose wristwatch flashed gold every time he shifted his arm. "I am a pilot," Henry corrected gently, turning to meet his gaze. The man nodded slowly, his expression softening into something Henry could not quite name. "Ah, well, you don't see that often." Henry smiled faintly. "No, I suppose you don't." There was no malice in the man's tone. Only the kind of casual remark one made when noticing a bird far from its usual migration path. And yet, Henry felt it settle into his chest like a stone. "You don't see that often." It was a small sentence. Simple in its construction. But in that moment, it stretched itself wide, filling every inch of the space between them. The man seemed content to leave it at that. But Henry found himself holding onto the weight of those words as the flight wore on. He thought about the years he had spent in cockpits, the thousands of flight hours logged in his record books, the long nights spent studying charts and weather patterns long after the others had gone home. He thought about the way he had learned, early on, that mistakes were never just mistakes when they belonged to men like him. Every flight, every landing had to be flawless. Not because he feared failure, but because he understood that for him, failure did not end at the runway. It followed him home. It whispered through airport terminals, through locker rooms and crew meetings, winding its way back to the next pilot of color who dared to step foot into the cockpit. Henry knew this because he had once been that young man, watching the sky with cautious hope. Now, as the clouds drifted lazily beneath the plane's wings, he wondered if anyone would ever fly far enough to outrun it. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed for evening service, Henry leaned back in his seat, letting the quiet press against him like the weight of the sky. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the woman in seat 2A rise carefully, her hands smoothing down the front of her jacket as she moved toward the restroom. As she passed his row, she hesitated, briefly, but enough for Henry to catch the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her face. It was not fear, nor even distrust, but the lingering aftertaste of something she had not yet decided how to name. Henry met her eyes. He held her gaze not in challenge, but in recognition, the way one might hold a mirror to the light. She nodded politely, but her smile was tight. When she returned, she did not meet his gaze again. As the plane descended toward its final approach, Henry glanced once more at the fading horizon. The sky had softened into muted gold, the kind of color that lingered long after the sun dipped below the edge of the earth. He wondered, as the wheels touched down, if that was enough, if the sky itself remembered the men who had flown beneath it, even when the world below refused to. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Henry felt the familiar weight of gravity pushing him back into his seat. A subtle reminder of the burdens carried by the body. The city sprawled below them, a mosaic of lights and possibility. But Henry knew better than to be deceived. The sky, in its grandeur, offered a solace that the ground could never provide. The disembarking process was always a blur. Passengers milling about like ants returning to their colony, each mind preoccupied with their own journey. But today, as he rose from his seat, the tension of the flight did not leave him. It clung to him, lingering in the cramped aisle, and Henry felt its pull. The subtle suspicion in the eyes of those around him. The moment his feet touched the terminal floor, he sensed it, the silent judgment in the air, the low hum of uncertainty vibrating from the people passing by. It wasn't just the usual, everyday discomfort of being a black man in a predominantly white space. It was something sharper, something more insidious. As he walked through the terminal, he found himself being watched with an intensity that didn't belong in a place of movement. A place of transition. In the rush of arrivals and departures, there should have been anonymity. But today there was none. Every glance lingered longer than it should. He passed by a group of businessmen, sharp suits, clean-cut faces. They whispered among themselves, and one man shifted just slightly to the side, his eyes scanning Henry as if trying to place him. The subtle glance was followed by an exchange of words too low to be heard but loud enough to be felt. Henry didn't have to hear them to know their meaning. He had lived with these assumptions for a lifetime. They saw him and tried to make sense of him on their own terms. At the baggage claim, the scene unfolded like one he had witnessed countless times before, though he had hoped he was beyond it. That his accomplishments might finally be enough to earn the respect of others. The woman in the khaki jacket, who had earlier given him a passing glance, was now lingering near the carousel, her eyes not so discreetly tracing his movements. He didn't have to look directly at her. He could feel her gaze, the way it followed him like a trail of smoke. Her discomfort was tangible, a reflection of the discomfort she couldn't name. And in that moment, Henry understood. She was wondering if someone like him truly belonged here. In this airport, in this space, in this world. His shoulders tightened, but he forced himself to keep walking, to keep moving forward, as though the weight of her suspicion couldn't press down on him in the same way it had done for decades. But Henry knew something others didn't see. It wasn't about the looks, the glances, the subtle slights. It was about the years of doubt, the constant question of whether, despite everything he had accomplished, despite the years of proving himself, he would ever truly be seen as someone who belonged. He was nearly at the exit when he heard his name. Henry. The voice was familiar, comforting in its suddenness. He turned, finding the man in the dark leather jacket, his face lined with the years of someone who had seen too much. It was Tom. An old colleague, a fellow pilot, someone who had worked with him during his early days. "Hey, man, it's good to see you. Been a while." Tom said with a grin. Offering a handshake. Henry reached out and clasped his hand. There was a moment of familiarity. A fleeting sense of warmth that made him briefly forget the weight of the day. Tom looked at him over. Still smiling. How's everything going? Back from the big flight? Henry nodded, trying to force a smile. Yeah, long trip. But I'm back now. Tom's smile faltered slightly, and he glanced over Henry's shoulder. His eyes scanning the terminal. Yeah, I noticed the looks, too. Tom muttered under his breath. His voice low. Some people. Man. It's ridiculous. Henry's stomach tightened. He didn't need Tom to say it aloud to know exactly what he meant. It was the look. The one that people gave him when they didn't understand how someone like him could hold the same title. The same position. As they did. But Tom, ever the loyal friend, tried to change the subject quickly. But hey, you've been doing great, right? The new routes. The corporate stuff. You're killing it. Henry nodded again, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. Killing it. Killing it. He had been trying to kill it for years. Hadn't he? Trying to prove that he was worthy. Trying to show that the flight deck belonged to men like him. But no matter how many hours he logged, no matter how many flights he commanded, it always came down to this moment. The subtle reminder that nothing, not even a uniform, could erase the doubt others held about his place. Yeah, Henry said quietly, his voice softer now. I guess I am. Tom gave him a slap on the back. But Henry barely felt it. Instead, he turned and looked back at the crowd of people. His mind shifting as the noise of the terminal became distant. He knew that this battle was one he would have to fight forever. It wasn't just about making it to the top. It was about what others saw when they looked at him. And in the end, no matter how high he climbed, he would never escape the shadow of that question. Do you belong here? As Henry walked out of the terminal and into the night air, the cool breeze on his face offered no comfort. There were no answers out here. No resolutions to the questions he carried. The city stretched before him, filled with the potential for what was and what could be. But Henry knew that even in this vastness, there was no place for someone like him to rest. Not yet. Not until he was seen as whole. Not until he was seen as more than just a man in a uniform. Henry walked out into the night. The city lights stretching out before him, twinkling like fleeting promises. The air felt thick, as though the weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours was hanging on his shoulders. He didn't have to say a word to anyone to know they were looking at him. He felt their eyes on him. The unmistakable tension that grew each time a person tried to figure out how he had gotten here. He had long grown accustomed to the looks. To the way people would scan him when he stepped into spaces that were, for people like them. But tonight, the weight felt heavier than usual. It was as though every corner of this city had been shaped by someone else's hand, someone else's expectations. Someone else's rules. He had fought so long to carve out a space for himself. But there it was again. That haunting question. Do I belong here? As he walked, the sound of his footsteps echoed. Steady and deliberate. The street was empty at this hour, and in the stillness, it seemed that everything had come to a quiet halt. The buzz of the day's chaos had faded into the background, leaving only the quiet hum of his thoughts. He had seen the signs earlier. The way the passengers in the airport avoided his gaze. The subtle but unmistakable shift in their demeanor when he entered the room. No one had overtly said anything. But the meaning was clear. They didn't see him as one of them. Didn't think he belonged in their world. Despite all his years of hard work. There were moments, fleeting thought they were, where Henry almost believed the lie. That he had overcome it. That he was seen. But it wasn't true. Was it? Even now, as he stood on the street corner waiting for the light to change. His mind couldn't stop racing. Every inch of this city, this world, reminded him that his achievements didn't erase the color of his skin. That his accomplishments were always going to be measured by someone else's standards. The next morning, Henry stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. The man who looked back at him was familiar but foreign, someone who had spent his whole life fighting for respect. For dignity, for the simple acknowledgement that he was as capable, as deserving, as anyone else. But there it was, that nagging feeling, the one that grew with every interaction, with every slight. You don't belong here. He had just returned from his flight. A smooth landing. A routine operation that should have been just another day at work. But as the hours passed, the unease crept into his thoughts, expanding with every quiet moment. There was a certain finality to the moments that would haunt him forever. The small, persistent glances. The silence in the air as people wondered if he belonged in a space designed for them. Henry knew better than to dwell on it for too long. He had learned to push it down. To focus on the task at hand. To keep moving forward. But this time, it was different. This time, the question refused to be buried. He dressed in the uniform that had become second nature to him. Every stitch a symbol of the work he had done to get here. But today, as he adjusted his collar and buttoned his cuffs, the uniform felt like armor. Armor that didn't shield him, but weighed him down. It wasn't just about the clothes, or the reputation, or the hours logged. It was about what people saw when they looked at him. He walked into the airport again, his stride steady but with the faintest edge of hesitation, as though the air itself was charged with the subtle weight of judgment. The terminal buzzed with the usual morning rush, but Henry knew that beneath the hum of conversation and the sound of rolling suitcases, there was something else simmering in the air, an unspoken understanding that people like him weren't meant to occupy the same spaces. Not in the way he had learned to do. As he passed through security, a man in a dark jacket glanced at him, then did a double take, his gaze lingering a moment too long. The brief moment of recognition was enough. Henry knew exactly what the man was thinking. He didn't need to hear the thoughts, to feel the judgment. It was in the way the man stiffened, the way his gaze lingered just a little longer than necessary, as though trying to figure out if Henry was truly where he was supposed to be. And then, the question returned, do I belong here? It was a long flight ahead, but Henry felt the weight of it before he even boarded. The plane was an island of chaos, with people scrambling to claim their places, their seats, their space. But it wasn't just the crowded aisles that made him uneasy. It was the air that shifted when he entered. The subtle change in the way passengers looked at him. The flight attendant, a young woman with wide eyes and too much eagerness, approached him, her expression tight with uncertainty. She didn't speak immediately, but he could feel her eyes scanning him, wondering if he belonged in the captain's seat. When she spoke, it was just above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir," she began, a smile painted on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "I just need to double-check your credentials." Henry didn't move, his eyes steady as he reached for his badge. "You can check my credentials," he said calmly, "but I assure you, I'm where I'm supposed to be." Her gaze faltered, but she nodded, moving on without another word. But the ripple she had caused in the cabin lingered, and he could feel it. He could feel the doubt, the discomfort, the subtle whispers that followed him as he made his way to the cockpit. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But each time, the question remained, do I belong here? Later, in the quiet after the flight, Henry sat in the crew lounge, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, the steam rising in a slow swirl that reminded him of the thoughts that never seemed to dissipate. His colleagues talked around him, laughing, sharing stories from their flights. But Henry's mind was far away, traveling back to that moment on the plane, when he had been questioned. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But the exhaustion was settling in, and he knew it wasn't just the physical strain of flying. It was the emotional fatigue of being asked over and over again if he truly belonged in the places he had worked so hard to occupy. The man who sat next to him, Greg, a senior officer, noticed the silence and nudged him lightly. "You okay?" he asked. Henry nodded, but the question lingered. Greg had been around long enough to know that sometimes it wasn't the flight that was the hardest part. It was everything else. "Yeah," Henry said, voice steady but distant. "Just thinking." And as the conversation shifted around him, Henry found himself caught in that same unspoken space. The one where you're trying to prove something you shouldn't have to prove. The one where you're wondering if today will be the day the world sees you as you are without question. Without doubt. Without hesitation. The days after the flight passed slowly, like the fog that clung to the streets of the city. The feeling in Henry's chest didn't dissipate. It was still there, a quiet but insistent ache that wouldn't leave. It wasn't just the looks, or the assumptions. It was the silence. The things people didn't say but still made clear. It lingered in every room he entered, every office he walked into, every street he crossed. He had learned how to keep his chin up, how to smile when the world started. But it wasn't enough anymore. The airport terminal, as Henry walked through it again, was no different. The faces that looked at him didn't change. Some avoided his gaze, others looked him up and down, as if measuring him against some unseen standard. In the sea of white faces, Henry's skin was an unfamiliar color, an ever-present reminder of the divide that could never be erased by a flight suit or a uniform. It was there, in every crease of a man's brow as he glanced at his ticket and then at Henry, wondering how it was that a man like him could sit in that seat. It wasn't supposed to matter. He was an officer, a captain, a man who had earned his place. But the stares, the subtle questions that lingered in the air, twisted that truth into something strange, something fragile. Was he really supposed to be there? It was moments like these that carried the weight of history. Times when Henry had to fight against the tension that wanted to push him out of spaces that weren't made for him. He had worked harder than most, sacrificed more than his fair share, only to be met with glances that reminded him that there was always someone waiting to question his right to exist in the spaces he fought to own. These were the moments that tested his resolve. It wasn't just that the world refused to see him. It was that the world couldn't see him without putting him into a box he hadn't asked for. A box that was far too small for who he was. And that box was suffocating. The next flight, though uneventful in the technical sense, weighed heavier than any he had ever flown. The air felt different that day, thicker with unspoken thoughts and quiet judgments. As he ascended, guiding the plane through the clouds, it occurred to him that it wasn't the height that made his heart race, but the weight of the ground below him. The ground that still found it impossible to believe that he belonged in the skies. That he belonged at the front of the plane, guiding it home. And so, when they landed, it wasn't the weather or the turbulence that lingered in his chest. It was the knowledge that, despite everything, the battle was never over. Every time he stepped onto that tarmac, every time he stepped into a room, there was someone who would doubt him. They might not say it. They might not even know it themselves. But it was there, a low hum in the background of every interaction. Back at home, as he sat in the quiet of his living room, the familiar hum of the city outside barely touching the silence inside. Henry tried to shake off the tension. He'd come so far, done so much. He had proved himself time and time again. But there was always that one question, lingering just beneath the surface. When will it be enough? He stared out the window, his hands resting on his knees, thinking of the hundreds of hours spent flying, of the sweat and the struggle of rising through the ranks. He had fought to wear the uniform, fought to climb higher, only to discover that his journey would be measured against something other than merit. It would be measured by something deeper, something far more insidious. The color of his skin. And it wasn't just him. It wasn't just the passengers who thought they knew better. The people who stepped into his space without acknowledging him. It was everyone, everywhere, who refused to believe that a man like him could stand at the top of the ladder, could take control of the cockpit, could fly a plane across the country with the skill and precision that anyone else might possess. It was the way society had conditioned itself to believe that some people were made to fly, and some were not. Henry's phone buzzed beside him, breaking through his reverie. It was a message from a colleague, a friend from another airline. Someone who had been in the business for years. His words were full of encouragement. But Henry could feel the unease creeping back in. The message, full of well-meaning sympathy, was a reminder of something he had long known. The message read, "You've earned this. You deserve to be where you are. Never forget that." But in his heart, Henry felt the echo of 1,000 voices questioning him. 1,000 eyes that hadn't yet learned to see him for who he truly was. Even with every victory, every step forward, the world was still trying to push him back. The next day, as he suited up and prepared for another flight, Henry realized that this wasn't something he could escape. The world was not going to change overnight. He had learned long ago that the fight against prejudice, the battle to be seen, was never quick or easy. It was a lifetime of small moments, of victories that felt hollow because the struggle never truly ended. But today, something shifted in him. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of constantly proving himself. Or perhaps it was the quiet acknowledgement that he couldn't wait for the world to see him. He could only live as he was. Proud of the man he had become despite everything the world threw at him. His worth wasn't defined by their assumptions. As he entered the cockpit, the familiar hum of the engines beneath him reminded him of his purpose. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about knowing his worth. About refusing to be measured by someone else's scale. And today, as the wheels of the plane left the ground, he made a promise to himself. He would never again question his right to stand where he stood. To fly as he had always dreamed. The plane soared into the sky, cutting through the clouds like a vessel breaking through the barriers of a long-held silence. And as Henry looked out the window, he realized that sometimes the biggest battles weren't fought in the cockpit, but in the quiet moments between takeoffs and landings. The moments when you face your own reflection and realize just how much you've had to overcome. The world may not always see him for what he was, but he would never stop showing up for it. For himself. Because in the end, it wasn't the eyes of others that mattered. It was the eyes he looked into every morning when he saw the man he had become. And the man he would continue to fight to be. It had been a long flight. But it wasn't the distance or the time that weighed on Henry. It was the silence that lingered after the plane had touched down. Silence had a way of slipping between the words people said. The gestures they made. The way they avoided eye contact or looked over their shoulders. It was the silence that haunted him every time he walked into a room or entered a space that wasn't built for people like him. He had learned to ignore it. To push it down. But it was still there. Lingering just beneath the surface. Walking through the terminal, Henry could feel it again. Like a fog pressing against his skin. The usual small talk. The distant greetings. They all carried that weight. People who didn't know him. Or even those who did. Had an uncanny way of treating him like a shadow. A presence that shouldn't be there but somehow managed to exist. He was used to it by now. Used to the cold stares. The faint hesitation when he spoke. The way some people could never quite mask their surprise that a black man could rise so high. Could command so much. It was a quiet day at the airport. But the undercurrents were loud enough to drown out the usual hum of passengers. Henry moved through the crowd. Trying to keep his head down. Trying not to let anyone see the frustration that simmered just below the surface. There were always those who had to check the system. Always those who looked twice before they allowed him to step into a space he had earned. And there were those who, even in silence, made it clear that they didn't think he belonged. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir," said a man standing by the gate. His eyes flicked over Henry's uniform. A flicker of uncertainty on his face. He didn't know it yet. But the question was already forming in his mind. Is this man supposed to be here? Henry felt it. The quiet tension. The slight hesitation. It wasn't the first time it had happened. And it wouldn't be the last. "Can I help you?" Henry asked. His voice steady but weary. He could already hear the unsaid words in the man's glance. The man paused, looking from Henry's face to the ground. Then back up. "Just wanted to confirm. Are you the captain for Flight 463? Henry's jaw tightened. He could see the man scanning his face. Trying to piece together why a man who didn't fit his mental image of a pilot would be standing in front of him. The man's hands were shaking just slightly. But it was enough for Henry to notice. "Yes," Henry said, with calm precision. "I'm the captain for this flight." The man blinked, clearly surprised. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, but closed it when he saw the certainty in Henry's eyes. He stepped back, muttering something about not wanting to bother him. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. Henry had long since stopped expecting that kind of acknowledgement. He stood there for a moment, watching the man walk away, feeling the familiar weight of that invisible question. Why did he always have to prove himself? Why couldn't they see that he belonged? The flight itself was uneventful. But it felt different somehow. The air was thick with unspoken words. The kind of words people only think to say when they are given permission. Henry had learned to read these moments. To understand the invisible boundaries people set up between themselves and him. It was always there. Those subtle ways that people of his skin color were made to feel they weren't quite meant to be in certain places. To take up certain spaces. As he steered the plane through the clouds, his thoughts drifted back to the terminal. It wasn't the first time he'd been questioned. And it wouldn't be the last. There were always those who would doubt him. Always those who would look at him as though he had somehow stepped outside the line. As though he were an exception rather than a rule. What hurt the most was that he had learned to accept it. He had learned to accept that the battle wasn't just about what he did. Or how well he did it. It was about the quiet assumption that people like him didn't belong in these spaces. He could fight it, but he knew that it would never be over. Every step forward was another reminder that he had to prove himself again. Every success only a momentary reprieve before the next round of doubt. And so, as he guided the plane through another calm stretch of sky, the hum of the engines providing a steady rhythm, Henry felt the pressure in his chest again. He didn't expect the world to change overnight. But it was hard not to hope for something more. It was hard not to wish that someday, people would stop questioning his place. That someday, the invisible lines would fade into the background. When they finally landed, it was as if the tension had followed them from the skies to the ground. He could feel it again. That silence, that weight, pressing against him as he made his way to the gate. He could hear the quiet murmurs, see the glances exchanged, and once again, it struck him. It wasn't enough to be good enough. He had to prove it every time. "Thank you, Captain," a voice said, interrupting his thoughts. It was one of the flight attendants. The woman looked at him with a smile. But there was something behind it. A sort of guarded politeness that told Henry more than she probably intended. She didn't quite believe that he belonged there. "Of course," Henry said, offering a small smile in return. But the moment had passed. And with it, the realization that the battle would continue. He couldn't stop the world from seeing him through the lens of its own biases. But he could keep walking through it. Keep living in the spaces he had earned. The walk through the terminal felt different now. Henry knew that no matter how many times he took his place at the front of the plane, there would always be someone waiting to question it. But it didn't matter. Not really. Not when he knew, deep down, that he had earned his place. And so he walked, with the knowledge that every step was a small act of resistance. Every step was a defiance of the things they thought he couldn't do. Of the ways they tried to make him smaller. He was big enough to fill the space. To stand tall in the places that were never meant for him. Tomorrow would come, and the struggle would start again. But for today, Henry would take this small victory. Because he had made it this far. And there was no turning back. He was going to keep fighting. Whether the world was ready or not. The hotel room was dimly lit. The soft glow from the streetlights outside barely penetrating the drawn curtains. Henry sat at the edge of the bed. His back stiff from the long hours spent navigating the skies and the day's tense exchanges on the ground. He stared at the reflection of his face in the window. His fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the glass as though it might somehow offer him clarity. It didn't. He was used to the isolation that came with his job. The long hours in the cockpit. The quiet moments alone. But tonight, there was a heaviness. A discomfort that he couldn't shake. It was a familiar discomfort. One he had learned to live with but never quite accepted. That afternoon, he had walked into the terminal with his usual precision. His uniform pressed. His mind focused on the routine of another flight. But then it happened again. Those looks. Those glances that came with the silent judgment. The people who looked him up and down. The ones who couldn't quite believe that a black man could fly a plane. Let alone be at the helm of an international flight. He had hoped, naively. Perhaps, that things might be different after all these years. But there it was. That invisible wall between him and the rest of the world. The kind that shifted and flexed with every interaction. But never disappeared. Even in his own workplace. The weight of it was always there. Pressing down on him. A constant reminder that no matter how high he climbed, some people would always see him as less than. The day had started innocuously enough. Pre-flight briefing. A quick walk through security. And then the usual banter with his crew. But as the flight progressed, so did the subtle undercurrents of discrimination. The looks from passengers when they saw him in the cockpit. The awkwardness in their voices when they asked for assistance. The unspoken doubt that colored every exchange. It wasn't the overt kind of racism. The kind that people could point to and condemn. It was quieter, insidious, It crept in through the back door, disguised as polite questions or well-meaning gestures. But it was still there, lingering in the spaces between words. As the plane began its descent into the city, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of it pressing in. The altitude, the smooth hum of the engines, the weightless glide of the plane. It all felt like a cruel reminder that even in the sky, in a space where he was as qualified as anyone else, he was still an outsider. His hands tightened on the controls, his fingers digging into the familiar metal. It wasn't about the flight anymore. It was about the battle. The fight to prove that he belonged. The turbulence was slight, but it didn't matter. His thoughts were clouded by the familiar question: why was it so hard to just exist? After the flight, he met with the crew in the airport lounge. He didn't feel like celebrating, he felt like he was running on autopilot. Just going through the motions. Smiling when necessary, answering questions with the practiced charm he had perfected over the years. But beneath the smile, there was an unease that he couldn't shake. He had made it to this point in his career. He had fought tooth and nail for every step. But why did it still feel like the battle was never over? Why did every accomplishment feel like it had to be questioned? Every success scrutinized? Every inch of progress met with silent resistance? He had been walking through that airport when it hit him again. Those looks. The ones that didn't seem to stop. No matter how successful he became. The ones that saw him not for the work he had done, but for the color of his skin. It was the woman at the counter. The one who barely met his gaze when she handed him his boarding pass. It was the man who stood next to him in the waiting area. The one who shifted uncomfortably when their shoulders brushed. It was the subtle movement of people trying to make sure he wasn't standing too close. Trying to distance themselves without ever saying a word. He had learned long ago that these moments weren't the exception, they were the rule. It was exhausting. The emotional toll of having to prove himself again and again. Of being expected to be more than everyone else just to be seen as equal. It was the quiet exhaustion of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how far he went, there would always be someone who would try to make him feel small. Later, as he made his way to the terminal, he caught sight of the man from earlier. The one who had hesitated to speak to him. Who had questioned whether he belonged. The man was now engaged in an animated conversation with a colleague. And Henry watched, almost without thinking, as their words flowed easily. As though the man's earlier hesitation had never happened. And it hit him. This is the world I live in. A world where you can work for decades, climb the ranks, earn your place, and still be seen as an outsider. Still be questioned, still be doubted. The people who treated him with respect only did so because they had no choice, because they could no longer afford to ignore his presence. But the world beyond this space, beyond this terminal, beyond this job, it wasn't ready to accept him. And deep down, he knew it would never be. The thought lingered as he walked past the man, his boots clicking on the floor with a steadiness that felt hollow. He passed by, nodded, but didn't stop. The man didn't even notice. The journey home was no different. Each step Henry took seemed to lead him further away from the world that wanted to see him as someone other than what he had worked so hard to become. He had climbed so high, but the weight of their doubts still followed him like a shadow. Lingering in the background of every conversation. Every moment of stillness. The worst part wasn't the confrontation. It was the silence that followed. The quiet, unspoken truth that nothing would ever change. Not truly. Not until people learned to see him not for the color of his skin, but for the work he had done. The life he had lived. That night, as he lay in bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling. And for the first time, the fight felt different. It felt heavier, like something that might never be resolved. Something that would haunt him no matter where he went. But in the quiet of the night, as the sounds of the city hummed softly through the window, he found a new understanding. This was his battle, the one he had to fight, day in and day out, just to prove that he belonged. No matter how hard it was, no matter how tiring it got, it was a battle he would have to keep fighting. And even though he was tired, even though the weight of it all felt unbearable, Henry knew that he couldn't stop now. Tomorrow will come, the struggle would start again. But tonight, in the quiet of his room, he let himself feel the weight of it all. He was tired. He was tired of fighting. tired of proving himself. But he wasn't done yet. And that, for now, was enough. Henry stood in front of his apartment window. The city sprawling beneath him. The lights twinkled in the distance. Each one a reminder of the world he moved through. Of the battles he fought every day. Even if no one saw them. The noise of the city, the hum of cars and voices below, faded into something quieter. A stillness that he couldn't escape. It had been a few days since that flight. The one that had left him feeling more exposed than usual. The doubt, the silent judgment, the looks from passengers. It was all too familiar. But now, something was different. The familiar sting of prejudice had been replaced by an undercurrent of anger that he couldn't shake. It was the quiet moments. The moments when no one was looking. That had a weight all their own. Even at home, even in the place that was supposed to be his refuge, the weight followed him. It didn't matter if he was alone in his apartment, or surrounded by colleagues who had long respected his work. The truth lingered. He was always going to have to prove himself. Even when it seemed like things were shifting. Even when he received accolades, awards, recognition. It was never enough to silence the whispered doubts. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at it. Another message from his supervisor about the upcoming flight. Another assignment. Another group of strangers to manage. Another chance to prove himself. He sighed and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the screen for a moment longer than he wanted to. It wasn't the work he dreaded. It was the possibility of facing those same silent questions again. The ones that came without a word, without a direct challenge, but were nonetheless there. It was a cold evening, and the air in his apartment felt heavier than usual. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, hoping the physical weight of it might ease something inside. But the tension in his chest only seemed to grow. It had been a long time since he'd felt like this. This exhausted by simply existing in a world that didn't believe he belonged. Even when every single piece of evidence said otherwise. The next day, the office was bustling with its usual chaos, papers everywhere, phone calls, deadlines, but Henry couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to the flight. To that moment when he had confronted the tension in the air and realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small. To feel like they were never meant to take up space. It was about the unspoken rules of a society that still held its prejudices deep in its bones. Even when the veneer of progress was polished. He had sat through countless meetings, listened to speeches about diversity and inclusion, about the importance of creating safe spaces for everyone. But when the moment came, when the opportunity to stand up and challenge those ingrained beliefs arrived, it was always someone else who took the reins. It was always someone else who spoke. Someone else who made the change. His silence, the silence of so many like him, became a shield that protected not just his peace, but the comfort of those who didn't want to face the ugly truths. But that shield had started to crack. The next flight was just as routine as the last. Boarding. The usual passenger exchanges, the smooth hum of the plane taking off. But as they climbed higher into the sky, Henry felt that same dissonance again. It was subtle, but undeniable. The flight was flawless, but his mind kept wandering to the moments before takeoff. To the way people had looked at him as he boarded. To the way his presence had been questioned, even though it shouldn't have been. The first-class cabin was quieter than usual. The faces that usually greeted him with polite smiles were now replaced by glances that felt heavy with judgment. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't an outright confrontation. But it was there, lingering, waiting. A young woman sitting a few rows ahead glanced up from her book. Then quickly looked away when she met his eyes. Another man, older, in a gray suit, gave him a quick, unsure look before returning to his drink. His fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that everything, from the moment he had stepped onto the plane to the minute the engines roared to life, was a performance. A performance where he had to convince everyone around him that he belonged in the cockpit. That he belonged in the captain's seat. The thought was suffocating. Why should he have to convince anyone of that? Why was his position, his seat, so much harder to accept than anyone else's? As the plane cruised over the clouds, Henry felt a sudden surge of frustration. He had been fighting, silently and outwardly, for so long. He had built his career, his reputation, all the while knowing that the moment he let his guard down, the moment he stopped pretending everything was fine, he would become the very thing they feared: angry, ungrateful, entitled. They wanted him to remain silent, to remain grateful, to keep working until he proved that he was worthy. But no matter how much he worked, no matter how much he accomplished, the silence remained. The silence that said you're not enough. And then, as if the weight of that silence was too much to bear, he snapped. In the middle of the flight, as the plane shifted slightly with the turbulence, Henry stood up, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Is this how you all see me?" he asked, his voice loud enough to make the passengers turn their heads. "Do you see me as a token? As someone who has to prove he belongs here? I don't owe you my presence. I don't owe you my gratitude for just being here. I've earned this seat just like everyone else." The passengers around him fell silent. For a moment, it felt like the entire cabin was holding its breath. Henry looked out the window, his mind racing, but his heart, for the first time, was clear. The next moments passed in slow motion. The stewardess, flustered, asked if everything was all right. A few passengers, uncomfortable with the confrontation, shifted in their seats, but Henry didn't back down. He kept his gaze steady, his heart pounding, but resolute. "This isn't just about me," he said, quieter now but no less firm. "It's about every single person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has been made to feel like their presence is an inconvenience. It's about all the little moments, the ones you don't see, the ones that make people question their worth." For a moment, there was a deafening silence in the cabin. But then something shifted. A passenger in the back nodded slowly, as if understanding. Another cleared their throat and muttered an apology. It wasn't much, but it was something. When the plane landed, the weight had lifted slightly. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot. But the air felt a little lighter. Henry had spoken, and for once, the silence was broken. As he disembarked, he caught the eyes of a few passengers. Their expressions no longer filled with judgment. Instead, there was something else: a subtle nod. A recognition that hadn't been there before. He didn't know what it meant, or if it would last. But in that moment, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe not for the world, but for himself. And sometimes, that was all it took. Tomorrow, the fight will begin again. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Henry allowed himself to feel the weight of progress. Even if it was just a small step.